Hello, tulips. As mentioned in my last check-in, I haven't done one of these in a long time, and there is a reason for that. I'm in this post and I don't like it, but yeah, TV took over for me at the end of last year with Heated Rivalry and has kind of had me in its grip ever since. And as a result, my reading numbers so far for the year are much lower than they would normally be. Go back and check my previous book reports. I read a lot, but so far this year, I have read only about half of what I had read at the same point of last year. I'm behind. And so in the spirit of, staying transparent, keeping up with the goals, I'm just going to do a Q1 book report for you guys and talk about some of the things that I'm reading. Again, Heated Rivalry being the driving force of my personality for several months now, it is romance heavy. We will get to Aunt C's Smut Corner at the end, as we always do. I would never leave you hanging. But I didn't just read smut in Q1 of 2026. Once again, we're using Storygraph to keep track of our reading. It's a great alternative to Goodreads, which is owned by Amazon. It is a smaller company. It's an independent company. But it does a lot of the same things as Goodreads, allows you to track your reading, and gives you all other kinds of insights. So if you're one of those people like my husband who tracks his sleep, couldn't be me, but if you want graphs and stats and statistics about your reading habits, it's a fun platform to use. Shout out to my friend Erica again, who turned me onto it. There will be a link to my Storygraph in the box thingy below. I want to know what you guys are reading, and as always, if you're reading any themes, you will notice, as per usual, that themes do tend to creep in with me. So first and foremost, one of the nonfiction books I read this quarter was Bad Company, Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream by Megan Greenwell. It does exactly what it says on the cover. This is a book about how private equity has moved into so many areas of American life. In particular, obviously, even though I live in the UK, I still talk about American politics and American culture all the time. It still affects me. It still impacts me. And I have a vested interest in how my home nation is or isn't doing. Private equity is bad, team. It's bad, and it's done a lot of damage. This book gives a sense of the history of how private equity as a business model has become more and more embedded into other American business models up to the point of taking them over. It tells this story both through historical recounting and also setting out some case studies of individuals taken through interview of people who've experienced it firsthand, whether because their company has been bought or consolidated, etc., etc. That makes it a really, really accessible read. It's just under 300 pages. It's not a long book, but it's packed with good reportage style information, as well as really, really digestible personal case studies to understand not just the societal impact and the economic impact, but the human impact of what happens when private equity with a specific agenda of aggressive shareholder value creation at the expense of almost any other aspect of business happens. It's worth your time. I recommend. I didn't just do nonfiction this quarter. I also really got back into some proper history reads and at different senses of scale, which I really thought was good. The first history book I read was an incredibly interesting book called The Dressmakers of Auschwitz. This was a history about something that I didn't even know existed. And it is about how specifically women in Auschwitz, Jewish women in Auschwitz, leveraged their skills in dressmaking, in fashion, in all of the attendant skills that come along with that, to survive the horrors of the Holocaust. The book is by Lucy Adlington, and goes into how the European Jewish community was very, very involved in fashion industries, not least of all because it historically was involved in the cloth trade. So a lot of longstanding community ties to that industry had led by the middle of the 20th century for the Jewish community to have ties elsewhere, whether or not they were religiously observant or just secular Jews. There were a lot of Jews in the fashion industries of Europe, whether they were, tailors and seamstresses in villages, or if they were working at the prominent fashion houses of the time. Something that I really liked about this book is it goes into what skilled labor used to look like in the fashion industry, because for most of human history up until the Industrial Revolution, it was a very, very tactile thing. Every single piece of clothing, every element of every single piece of clothing had to be made. And that meant that there were a lot of specialized skills, not just average everyday clothes making, which was something, a skill that most women especially were expected to have to some extent, but things like pattern making, pattern cutting, sourcing textiles, even more specialist niche things like embroidery and the making of certain kinds of details, things that are still niche and artisanal today, but there were probably more people that actually were trained up through apprenticeships or what have you in those skills. And this book is about the women from across Europe and across all of these skill sets who were, let's be blunt, enslaved by the Nazi regime, but found a way to survive by leveraging this specific set of skills. And apparently in Auschwitz, there was almost a literal fashion atelier, a group of women who were charged with fashion design for the high-ranking female partners of the SS and the German High Command. This was a history that I didn't know existed. It makes a lot of sense, obviously, with hindsight, but the operation of it, the scale of it, it was truly, truly eye-opening. This book details how the very well documented seizure of victims' goods happened, particularly in the death camps, and how then personal goods, famously things like, gold and jewelry were stolen from victims of the Holocaust, but then were redistributed to the German High Command. How, the Nazi regime, amongst its many other horrific crimes, were war profiteers. They were looting and pillaging from their victims. And specifically how the female partners of the Nazi regime were also benefiting in terms of fashion, how they were getting access to fabrics or materials that were not available to other German women due to, strict rationing and other things at this time, how slave labor was used to produce it, how some of the women in this dressmaking atelier, would bargain for additional favors or for food, or would use the trade networks to try and smuggle goods or messages to and from the outside. And ultimately, how many of them survived specifically because their skills were so valued by the female partners of the Nazi regime. It was a fascinating, fascinating story. Very difficult to listen to. As you might imagine, with anything having to do with this history, it does not stint on the details of the brutality, but with such a uniquely gendered view into this aspect of the death camps. I think sometimes, we quite rightly focus on the industrialized murder that these camps were designed around, especially towards the second half and end of the war. But this gave me a greater sense into the labor aspect of the concentration camps. And once again, how women in particular were able to leverage skills to survive in ways that had never even occurred to me, but with the benefit now of hindsight, make a lot of sense. This is a powerful, powerful read, and once again draws very, very heavily on direct interviews with the survivors of Auschwitz, most of whom have since passed away. So this book is the last living memory of some of these people. And again, it was an aspect of the concentration camps that I had never ever heard of before and really, really enjoyed learning about, even though it's a very difficult subject. Sticking with economic rage, however, the next nonfiction book I read was Bailout, an inside account of how Washington abandoned Main Street while rescuing Wall Street by Neil Barofsky. That's a lot of buzzwords in the title, but once again, it does what it says on the tin. Neil Barofsky was a lawyer for the U.S. Attorney's Office who rose to prominence in the Southern District of New York by bringing drug pins to justice. But he took on a job as, I think, an inspector general, basically a watchdog, overseeing the TARP programs in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. His job was to make sure that funds were being used appropriately and to give an accounting back to Congress and the American people as such about whether or not justice was being done in the wake of dramatic financial mismanagement. Basically, what Barofsky was trying to do is hold big banks practically accountable for the damage that they had done to American consumers. And this book, by his own words, is a recounting of how he feels he failed to do that. Not for lack of trying, but frankly, out of lack of the actual institutional might and willpower being brought to bear for true accountability. Barofsky is very, very angry about this, and I think he's right to be. But he gives a very, very, in my opinion, meticulous, clear-sighted recounting of what his feelings are versus what the facts are. And I think with the rigor of someone who's very, very well trained in the law, is able to differentiate the two and be very, very clear about why he's angry from a legal perspective. His opinion is that the U.S. Treasury Department did not provide the necessary support for the kinds of recommendations and enforcement actions that his office thought and recommended needed to take place. His view is that, Treasury officials were outright hostile to their mission and therefore kept it from serving its function. The point of view that Barofsky puts forward is that more people, especially, lost their homes than should have done or would have done if some of the measures that were put in place had been enforced correctly. This is the tale of a person who believes very, very strongly in the rule of law and the value of government, and simultaneously feels that the government did not do its job. Very, very important things to hold in parallel, I think, at various moments in history. Barofsky is an interesting character because, by his own admission, he's not very good at politics and didn't really want to be. He's not a person who wanted to be a politician. He's not very interested in the political machinations of Washington. He came to do a job, he thought, and is openly frustrated with the cultural as well as the systemic or structural barriers towards getting certain things done in the bureaucracy of government, but also in the social structural bureaucracy of certain kinds of capitalism that don't incentivize some people making less money or, certain institutions being less powerful than they currently are. Most critically, he makes the case I think correctly, that a lot of the same institutions that were too big to fail in 2008 are even bigger now, so that if and when they also fall, collapse, are damaged in some way, they're now bigger trees that are going to take down more things with them. This is a really, really timely moment, I think, because, as I've ranted elsewhere, there are a lot of warning signs flashing for both the American and other Western economies, particularly ones whose sense of value creation has become more and more narrowly defined in a smaller number of companies that command a larger and larger percentage of things like GDP. Not diversifying one's risk, whether on a personal level or a government one, still a bad idea. And also, this book, I think, is a good read to be reminded of how governments tend to, philosophically, protect institutions more than individuals and people. And the only thing that checks that kind of default mentality is collective action, resistance, or pressure. I.e., there's still a role for citizens to play in holding their governments to account. Just saying. The next book I read was another historical tome, this one on a slightly larger scale. It's called The Great Contradiction, The Tragic Side of the American Founding by Joseph J. Ellis. This was such an interesting book because it is a history of the era of the American founding, and as the title indicates, the great contradiction at the heart of the stated legal, ethical, moral, political intentions of the American Revolution and the institution of the American Republic, and who was deliberately left out of that program and why. The two main groups being, according to Ellis, obviously enslaved African Americans and Native Americans. This book made a huge impact on me, not because I didn't know a lot of the individual historical facts or elements or statements that it laid out, but what this book did was work through the second and third order implications of a lot of historical decisions or policies or statements that don't always get played through in the average history education. The biggest example that jumps out at me was the statements of when certain demographic migrations to the Americas happened. Ellis points out that the vast majority of African, I'm going to say immigration, to the Americas was a result of the slave trade, so was forced. But the majority of it happened in the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries. So if you are a person of African American descent of any kind living in America, your ancestry probably dates back to that period, that specific period of the transatlantic slave trade. Whereas most white Americans can trace their ancestry to immigration that happened in the 18th or 19th centuries. In other words, if you are a Black American, you likely have roots that have been in America longer than any average white American. And on the surface, I knew that. I knew that I roughly knew the periods of the transatlantic slave trade. I knew when that happened. And I knew most of the dates of other waves of migration from Europe. But it never, ever jumped out to me that what that meant was that, practically speaking, most African Americans of multi-generational legacies in America have frankly been here longer than the average white American. So that puts a lot of claims or assumptions often put forward, particularly by nativist and bluntly white supremacist groups, into an interesting new perspective, doesn't it? I mean, it is a delightful fact, to shut your racist uncle up at Thanksgiving, I guess, but it's also kind of a sobering reminder as well, isn't it? That the titular contradictions of the American founding, we're still dealing with it and we're still working through them. Ellis has a really, really cool framing device that I loved. He sets out a taxonomy early in the book of two different kinds of tragedies. He calls them Greek and Shakespearean. The idea being that in a Greek tragedy, you're up against fate, you're up against circumstances, the gods are against you, and, your destruction is kind of outside of your own control. It's just something that's going to happen to you no matter what. Versus a Shakespearean tragedy where individuals or people or groups kind of sow the seeds of their own destruction. And the invitation that Ellis puts out is, in looking at American history, which kind of tragedy do you think different atrocities or decisions fall into? Are we living with things that were always going to be a tragedy, no matter what, no matter who, no matter the time, just because human nature is what it is? Or are we dealing with man-made tragedies or some weird combination of the two? I don't know. I was struck by that framing device and that taxonomy, and it's something I'm going to be thinking about for a long time. One thing that I really, really enjoyed with this book was learning about how a lot of the founding fathers, many of whom were themselves slave owners, wrestled with that contradiction. Some outright avoided it. Some outright refused to wrestle with it. They didn't want to think about it, or, we can't always apply modern ethics to past people, right? But there were founding fathers that were aware of this contradiction within themselves and did wrestle with it to different degrees. Interestingly enough for me, and not entirely surprisingly, this book spends a lot of time on George Washington, who, for all of his faults, slave ownership being the most prominent, I think remains the founding father that I'm most partial to, because he was a man who had his eye to legacy and precedent in a really important way. And had we not had a person like that as the literal, founder, the first person to ever hold the job, I think the American Republic, the American institutions, even things like the American presidency as an institution would look very, very different. And I value the seriousness that Washington explicitly brought to the job and how seriously he took it and how aware he was of the idea of leaving a legacy. Apparently, towards the end of his life, he was really, really struggling with his legacy as a slave owner. Hi, Tizzy. Yeah, I agree. Because he seemed to recognize, as did other founding fathers, the inherent contradiction between the statements that all men are created equal, except for this group of people on whom my livelihood depends that I can continue to brutalize and exploit them. And he had the self-awareness and kind of the introspection and the education and the temperament to at least ask questions of himself of how he could justify something that probably in his darkest moments he had to concede was unjustifiable. He tried to thread the needle by setting up for the freedom of his slaves after his death, but most of the slaves that his household owned were actually dower slaves. They belonged to the estate of his wife, and he could not legally free them till after her death. It is complicated, and, Martha Washington, lived with the fear that her slaves would rise up and kill her in order to be free. Valid. But again, I've just found it so interesting to, this book dwells on Washington because of his historical precedent, but also because we seem to have quite a bit of evidence in terms of his own writing, his own businesses, his own account keeping, his own legal paperwork, to give us a sense of his wrestling with this, not just as a legal issue, but also as a moral issue. Whereas, interestingly, someone like Thomas Jefferson, the intellectual of the American Revolution, the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, liked to think about high concepts from an ivory tower, but didn't always like to deal with the everyday mess and muck of, big ideas that could inconvenience him, which is why he kept the half-sister of his dead wife as a concubine. On the other side of this is the other contradiction, the status and the rights and the privileges of Native Americans. How a group of pre-existing people could and should fit into this concept of a new nation state. And once again, this book does a good job of showcasing how different founding fathers viewed this issue differently. Some had very, very positive views of Native populations. Some had fought with them in the Revolution and other wars. Some had cordial relations with Native neighbors. Some had genuinely paternalistic, views of what they thought their role as white saviors needed to be to an indigenous population. Others were, aggressively hostile, and you thought that natives needed to be, eliminated and eradicated. Like, people were complicated, and there wasn't just one blanket view that could be said to encompass all of the American founding fathers. The book kind of goes into how, therefore, at different times in the early history of the Republic, different perspectives or different leadership under different presidents led to different kinds of relationships with Native populations. Something that I took away from this book specifically, as someone who was raised Mormon, was the view that Native Americans needed to be civilized, i.e., they needed to adopt white ways of doing things, specifically settled agriculture and civilization in the sense of settled living in a structural way. So not the nomadic lifestyle, not hunting or gathering, or not seasonal migrations. The idea that you have to farm a plot of land in order to have claim over it. I mean, this is foundational in the Enlightenment. I think it was John Locke that, talked about, the claim that you have over land is the fact that you have improved it, you have worked it. And that is what made settler colonialism valid in the eyes of certain Enlightenment thinkers over the views of indigenous peoples who didn't settle and work it and improve the soil or improve the land the way that settled agriculture did. It's racist, it's white supremacist, but that is the philosophical foundation of how the Enlightenment got to where it did, and therefore how early Americans, specifically baptized in the waters of the Enlightenment, were thinking about it. The reason that struck me so specifically from the ex-Mormon perspective, that view that you can civilize and whiten indigenous populations is a strain of thinking in early Mormonism, and is indicative of how a lot of people thought civilization worked, that you could actually make people more white, whether or not that meant physiologically or just in their behaviors and their habits. But the idea that you could, again, this is racist language, and I don't mean it in the sense that I condone it, but that you could tame or civilize indigenous people and make them behave, look, or act more white over time in ways that would allow them to integrate into white society. And that was an explicit goal of a lot of leaders of the early American Republic, whether they were religious leaders like some early leaders in Mormonism and other faith movements, or politically in terms of presidents or governors who wanted to integrate Native peoples into their populations, but wanted it to be on very specific behavioral, cultural, and racial terms. I don't know. Again, this book did a really good job of taking individual elements of history, incidents, treaties, dates, battles, conflicts that I knew about in isolation, but putting it together in a more linear narrative for me, and then taking me through the second and third order implications of certain facts, stats, or figures, and forced me to think about this period in different ways. Highly, highly recommend this as a piece of history reading if you are at all interested in concepts of like who gets to be an American right now. Next up, a couple of audiobook recommendations. One, The Future of Truth by Werner Herzog. This is a collection of essays by Werner Herzog, quite literally about the meaning of art and what truth looks like in a kind of post-truth world, whether that's through documentary filmmaking or mockumentary filmmaking or digital art or internet culture or what have you. And again, I said audiobook. I listened to the audiobook as narrated by Herzog himself. He has a fantastic voice. If you want a good collection of essays on a really, really thoughtful intellectual, highly, highly recommended. Then I'd listen to this man read the phone book. I listened to Stephen Fry's Greek Myths, the third book in his series. This one is called Troy. It's about the Trojan War. I love it. But again, I really, really recommend it in the audiobook form to get all of Stephen Fry's wit and charm and beautiful narrative style. I love Stephen Fry. I love him. I've enjoyed every single installment of this series. Start with mythos, if you want to start quite literally at the beginning, but the full series takes the reader or listener through the ancient Greek myth cycle, starting with the creation myths, all the way up through the stories of the Trojan War and the Odyssey, and therefore the establishment of the recognizable Greek city-state system that people would have recognized in ancient Greece. Because don't forget, the Odyssey or the Trojan War takes place in a mythical time of heroes, a mythic heroic age, and the foundation of the world literally takes place at the foundation of the world. But the Greek myth cycle is designed to take the listener or the believer or what have you through creation all the way kind of to the founding of recognizable civilization, i.e. how mankind got here, how, various things like the Athenian law code was established, why things are the way they are. It's fantastic. Stephen Fry is a wonderful writer and he is a wonderful narrator. Absolutely worth your time. Another audiobook and another collection of essays, Why I Love Horror, Essays on Horror Literature, edited by Becky, Siegel, Spratford. Literally just takes a bunch of the best and most popular horror writers working right now and sets them all the question, why do you like the horror genre? And allows each of those writers to make their case of why they like it, why they read it, why they write it. I am fairly new to horror in terms of my reading journey as an adult. I didn't start getting into it until well into adulthood, but it is an area that I've been reading more and more of in recent years, and so I want to read more of for the rest of this year. So I thought I'd start that goal off with a bang by this fabulous little introduction. So if you want to test the waters of why horror literature appeals to people and may appeal to you, this was a really cool one. And then finally, my last nonfiction book that I read this past month, again, inadvertent theme alert, was The Nazi Mind, 12 Warnings from History by Laurence Rees. this was a powerful one. So the premise that Rees puts forward is history with a gloss of psychology. He's not trying to psychoanalyze absolutely everything about, the Nazi high command or the whole of the movement, but he is trying to distill buckets of behaviors that can be reasonably academically classified and explained through psychology, told as a history. This was an intense read, and he separates it out, as he says, into 12 lessons, 12 sets of behaviors, 12 indicators of how people can be made, built, encouraged, allowed to do terrible things at scale. The thing that this book really brought home to me in reading it is that, what's that old quote about the banality of evil? That it doesn't take extraordinarily evil people to do extraordinarily evil things. Rees points out, for example, that proportionally, psychopaths are a minority of the population, but that as a set of behavioral indicators, also a minority in the population, but there are more sadists than psychopaths. And sadistic tendencies can be cultivated, encouraged, and empowered. So even if you wouldn't qualify as a full-on sadist in some ways, even tendencies in that area can be nurtured either by people or by circumstance. Rees does a really good job of continuously reminding the reader that behaviors are complex things. There's almost never a single inciting reason or incident why people do the things they do. The amount of probably truly horrifically, medically, psychologically evil people in the world is probably quite small. Most of the time what we're dealing with is people who have, again, a tendency or may have had a set of cultivating experiences growing up that set them on certain paths that had their circumstances or their genetics or their nurturing or had any number of things gone differently, so would their life journeys, right? And what I think Rees really points out is how even good people, or even people who want to be good and who think of themselves as good, can be made to do terrible things because they're taught that it's the right thing. They can convince themselves that they're doing the right thing to preserve their own sense of sanity, their own sense of righteousness. How truly evil people can create systems of structural permission that allow others to enact some of the most terrible crimes humans are capable of perpetuating on one another. Like, this book spends a lot of time talking about how propaganda works, what the psychological itches it scratches, how astute creators and distributors and users of propaganda try to hit specific notes in their audiences to induce certain responses, how they know what they're doing about this. This book also spends a lot of time talking about the value of distance while doing harm. So, for example, but long before the horrors of the final solution were ever, fully dreamt up and enacted, there was still campaigns of explicit violence against various communities, most prominently the Jewish community. But how very early on the regime learned how even committed, ferocious anti-Semites most of them could only do so much violence against other people before it would affect them psychologically. Members of the German army who early on were conducting mass shootings, for instance, reported back what we would now call PTSD. A lot of them could not live with the trauma of what they had done. They could not rationally justify the amount of killing that they had undertaken. And of course, the regime saw this as a problem to be overcome, and of course, cultivated individuals who were legitimate psychopaths and did not experience, trauma when inflicting, huge amounts of industrial violence on other people. Those are the ones who rose to the ranks of the SS, but they were vanishingly few in number. Most people, even ones who truly believed in the political outcomes that the regime was trying to achieve, could not deal with inflicting that kind of violence. There's something about the human mind and psychology that does not bear up against perpetuating that kind of violence. And how much, therefore, the regime spent in trying to create distance between the people perpetuating the violence and their victims. That is why things like the industrial killings of the concentration camps were conceptualized and developed in the way that they were, to make it so that the people, perpetuating these horrific crimes could feel a sense of emotional distance from their actions. It was genuinely fascinating to learn about how much effort went into creating the psychological space to encourage average citizens to report on their neighbors or to turn children into future Nazi soldiers. How much thought went into whole programs of programming to get people to act in specific ways that would give the regime what it wanted. I'm going to butcher this as a quote, but to paraphrase, Rees points out that so many people lived with the contradiction of the Nazi regime because while they might have found the methods distasteful, at the end of the day, they agreed with the stated goals. And that particular combination, where you might find the actions of a ruling group distasteful, but if you think that what they're doing is ultimately the right thing to do for the nation, you'll go along with it. That's an incredibly timely thing to be thinking about right now in all of the Western democracies. But again, obviously, I've got America on my mind. It helped me understand how a lot of people I know probably go along with things that I don't understand. It's not because they think that the actions themselves are justifiable, but at some level, it's because they agree with the underlying eventual goal. That's a really sobering thing to think about. I don't know. This is a fairly recent book. It was published, I think, in late 2025. It is good history. It is meticulous history. It is not purporting to be anything except history, again, with that gloss of psychology. I think a lot of people need to read this book right now, though. If for no other reason than to be aware how leadership of all kinds and of all political persuasions creates structural permission for citizens, for institutions, for groups of people to behave in ways that further the ruling class, regime, parties, whatever, goals. I think it encourages everybody at the end of the day to be very, very thoughtful about what your own political goals are, because I think that will make all of us as a citizenry less likely to be roped into condoning things that should never be condoned. Yeah, read this book. And then finally, Do you know what I haven't been doing a lot of this quarter? I haven't been reading a lot of fiction that isn't romance. Again, these boys, they've done something to me. Like I'm go back and read my book reports. I'm a romance fan. I'm a romance stan. But I need to read other kinds of fiction, right? And I have not been doing that. So towards the end of Q1, I self-corrected, and I'm making sure that I'm going back to reading fiction, and I started with Discontent by Beatriz Serrano. This is a Spanish author. This is a novel that was first published in 2023. Obviously, I did not read it in Spanish. I read it in an English translation, and it is a modern novel of the modern workplace, and it is dark, and it is humorous, and it is, oh God, if you've ever been frustrated with an office job, this book gets it. The absurdities and the contradictions and, the push-pull on the modern worker's identity between what we do to earn a living versus the actual lives we want to lead. This is a short book. It's a short novel. It's not a dramatic one. It's a slice of life in a lot of ways, but again, it's a dark humor novel. I really, really liked it. So if you're looking to wet your whistle with some international reading, again, Discontent, Beatriz Serrano. Really, really liked it. And now, once again, my children, my dubs, Aunt C Smut Corner. Read a lot of smut, as per usual. I'm putting all of the lists and the covers on the screen so you can see, but I do want to give you some of the highlights from Q1. Kristen Callahan came out with her first book in a hot minute. She's a writer who I really like. Her latest is called Only on Game Day. It's the latest in a series of sports romances that she's written, but she has written other genres in the past. I really like her writing, and I was glad to see the author return for her latest. Continued series by Brittany Nicole. I'm going to butcher her name. Serrano, McMaster, Odette Stone, Julia Connors, Tessa Bailey, the Michelangelo of dirty talk. I will read anything she writes. I love her. She also came out with her latest sports romance called Catch Her If You Can. Really liked it. Bryn Weaver, one of my favorite dark romance girlies. She writes the violent stuff. Like her main characters for this series are serial killers. It's fun. The first in her new series, Tourist Season, I read. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. I also continued series by Stephanie Archer and Piper Rain and Ruth Stilling. Let's see. There was a new Sloane St. James book called Of Ink and Alchemy. It was okay. It wasn't as good as her sports romance series that I've read previously. So I'll probably continue with this series, but it wasn't my favorite compared to some of her other previous novels. I also started a new series by Ainsley Booth. Finished Helena Hunting's Toronto Terror series with her sixth book, If You Keep Me. Blah, blah, blah. What else did I read? Oh, I did read another novel, but this one is genre fiction. I started a new fantasy series by Grace Draven. The first book is called Radiance. It was really interesting. I used to read fantasy like you would not believe, but I have dipped out of it as a genre in recent years, and I need to get back into it. I have an entire Brandon Sanderson series that was gifted to me like 2 Christmases ago by one of my little brothers that I have been swearing I'm going to get into, and I really, really just need to keep my promises. So, like I'm trying to get back into, normal fiction, I've got to get back into some other genres. Fantasy is one of them. What else? Elle Kennedy's latest came out, Love Song. It was pretty good. I enjoyed it. As longtime viewers know, I'm really, really excited for her off-campus series, which is now confirmed to be coming out in May. Please be good. Please be good. Please be good. This is a next generation story of the characters set out in the off-campus universe. So that's what the tie-in is. I enjoyed it. Elle Kennedy is a fun writer. I'm curious to see who comes next in her next gen series. And then finally, continued existing series that I'm already reading by Jennifer Susevic, Candy Steiner, and Maren Moore. So all in all, let me scroll back up to the top here. I have read 36 books so far in Q1 of 2026. That is 14 below where I'm supposed to be at this time of year. I try to read about 200 books a year. And as always, this does not include the books that I reread, just for casual reading as I, go to bed, or when I'm sitting in the dog park letting Tizzy run around with all of her mates. So I only count the books that are new to me. I don't count rereads. But even though I'm behind on my numbers, I have read 36 books so far. That's my Q1 book report. You will notice, like I said, some themes, particularly in the nonfiction world. But that's how I tend to do things. So tell me what you've been reading. Tell me what you've been loving. Help me get back into fiction if you have any specific recent recommendations of books that I need to read. If you've read something that just had a huge impact, tell me about it. Tell me why you liked it. I need all the help I can get. But thank you. I know these aren't always like the most exciting videos to film, but I really like filming them and I like talking about books. So thank you for indulging me, kittens, and we'll see you back again here soon.